Sometimes the mind notices something before you do. A shift in the room, a silence that feels wrong. You tell yourself it's nothing because that's easier. The people in tonight's stories did the same, until they couldn't anymore. I'm Lurk. Leave a like, subscribe, and let's begin. I spent the first years of my life living in a house that, even back then, I knew was strange. At the time, it didn't bother me. In fact, I loved it. When you're a kid, unusual things don't feel unsettling the way they do when you're older. They feel interesting. They feel like adventures waiting to happen. But looking back now, with the perspective of adulthood, I realize just how bizarre that house really was. The building itself was incredibly tall and narrow. Almost like someone had taken a normal house and stretched it upward instead of outward. It reminded people of those attached townhouses you see in older neighborhoods, except ours stood by itself. 3 floors stacked on top of each other, with a basement below and an attic above. The place looked like it had been built by someone with a lot of creativity, but not a lot of common sense. Every part of it had strange little features. There were 2 fully functional fireplaces, even though the house wasn't particularly large. One sat in the living room and the other on the second floor in a room that had no obvious reason to contain a fireplace at all. The basement had a shower stall sitting almost awkwardly in the middle of the room, as if someone had decided halfway through construction that it would be a good place to put one and never reconsidered the idea. The backyard was so small that it was almost funny. If you took more than 4 or 5 steps in any direction, you were guaranteed to bump into the fence. But my favorite feature of the entire house was something most kids never get to experience: a dumbwaiter. It was an old rope-pull dumbwaiter that ran between the kitchen and my bedroom upstairs. It was the kind of thing you usually only see in old buildings or in movies about strange Victorian houses. To me, it was amazing. I used to send things up and down in it all the time. Sometimes snacks, sometimes toys. Occasionally, I would just ride things in it for fun and watch them disappear through the little hatch. The whole house had that same kind of odd charm. It felt like a place with personality. For years, I never thought about how old the house really was or how strange its design might be. It was just home. Unfortunately, charm doesn't fix structural problems. As time went on, my parents started running into more and more repair issues. Pipes needed replacing. The parts of the roof needed work. Some of the walls had problems that would cost a lot to fix. Eventually, it reached a point where the repairs were going to cost more money than my parents were willing to invest. That's when they decided we had to move. At the time, I didn't fully understand their reasoning. I just knew we were leaving a house I loved. Preparing for the move turned into a long process of sorting, packing, and clearing things out. Now, I was old enough by then that my parents expected me to pack most of my own stuff. Since I had the dumbwaiter connecting my room to the kitchen, I developed my own lazy system. Instead of carrying boxes downstairs, I would just toss things into the dumbwaiter and send them down to the kitchen. It felt like a clever solution at the time. At the same time, I had started stuffing my clothes into the closet in a way that only a kid could manage. I didn't neatly fold anything. I just shoved everything inside until the pile became so dense that it almost formed a solid block of fabric. Eventually, my parents told me I needed to clear the closet out properly, so one afternoon I started pulling everything down and sorting through it. That's when I noticed something I had never seen before. At the very top of the closet near the ceiling, there was a small wooden panel. It blended into the ceiling so well that I had never noticed it before. But once the clothes were cleared away, it became obvious. It was an attic entrance. The house had an attic, of course. I just never realized there was access to it through my closet. Being a curious kid, I immediately wanted to see what was up there, so I climbed onto the thick pile of clothes I had shoved into the closet. The fabric had become packed so tightly that it worked like a strange step stool. Standing on top of that pile, I reached up and pushed the attic panel open, so the door creaked slightly as it moved. Then I pulled myself up and looked inside. The first thing I noticed was something that didn't make sense. It wasn't as dark as it should have been. Attics are usually pitch black unless someone turns on a light, but this one had a faint red glow. As my eyes adjusted, I realized where the light was coming from. Someone had strung old red Christmas lights across the wooden beams of the attic. The lights were dim and faded, but they were still working. The red glow made the entire attic feel strange and dreamlike. That wasn't the only strange thing. As I looked around, I noticed small cracks and holes in the floorboards. Peeking through them, I could see parts of the rooms below. Some of the holes looked directly down into the bedrooms. It felt unsettling to realize someone standing up there could watch everything happening in the house beneath them. Then I noticed something else. The attic wasn't empty. See, it looked like someone had been living there. The insulation had been pulled away from sections of the walls and covered with plastic sheets. Near one corner was an old metal gurney, the kind you might see in a hospital, except this one was covered in sleeping bags, blankets, and sheets that looked like they had been piled there for someone to sleep on. Next to the gurney sat an old refrigerator. It was a faded mint green color, rusty in places, clearly very old. Out of curiosity, now I walked over and opened it. To my surprise, the refrigerator still worked. It hummed softly when I tested the door. The realization that someone had set up a place to live in our attic was strange enough. But then I saw the thing that made everything feel wrong. Bones. There were bones everywhere. At the time, I was just a kid. I didn't know much about anatomy. But even with limited knowledge, I could tell that these bones came from many different kinds of animals. Some were small. Some were large. Some were clean and white, as if they had been stripped naturally. Others looked older and darker. They had been gathered into piles near the center of the attic. 6 separate piles, each made up of different bones. The piles looked random, like someone had simply collected whatever they found and stacked them together. 2 of the piles looked different from the others. Those bones were blackened, charred, like someone had tried to burn them. Near those blackened piles, the wooden walls of the attic were marked with dark streaks. At first they looked like random smears, but when I looked closer, I realized the markings were writing. Someone had used bone charcoal to write words across the boards. Most of the writing was messy and hard to read, just smudges and scratches, but one word appeared more than once. Sorry. The word had been written again and again in different places near the burned bones. I remember standing there in the dim red light, staring at those words and those piles of bones, not fully understanding what I was looking at. I didn't stay long. Eventually, I climbed back down through the attic door and closed it. At the time, I didn't tell my parents exactly what I saw. Maybe I didn't fully process it. Maybe I didn't want to think about it too much. But years later, the memory still stays with me, because that attic had been sitting right above my bedroom the entire time we lived there. For 8 years. While I slept every night, someone or something had once lived in that space, and the only thing they seemed to leave behind was a strange, red-lit room filled with bones, and the word "sorry" written over and over again on the walls. When I was about 8 years old, my family made a huge change in our lives. Until that point, we had been living in South Florida in a busy, crowded area. where there were always cars driving by, neighbors everywhere, and stores just a short drive away. Life there felt loud and normal, like the kind of place where something strange almost never happened. Then we moved. My parents decided to move north into a very small town in North Florida. It was the kind of town where everyone seemed to know everyone else. The roads were quieter, the houses were spaced far apart, and the woods surrounded everything. It honestly felt like something straight out of one of those old Goosebumps books I used to read as a kid. The change was huge. Instead of city noise and lights, we had dark nights, long empty roads, and thick woods everywhere. During the day, the town seemed peaceful, but at night, it could feel very isolated. Sometimes you could step outside and not hear a single car for long stretches of time. Over the 15 years that my family has lived in that house, a lot of strange things have happened. Living out there, you start getting used to weird sounds, things moving in the woods, animals wandering near the house, and moments where the place just feels off. But out of everything that happened in that house over the years, the strangest experience happened when my sister moved back in with my parents. My sister was already grown by that point, almost 30 years old. She had been living with her husband, who was in the military. At the time, he was deployed overseas to Afghanistan. That left her alone with their newborn baby. Anyone who has ever been around a newborn knows how exhausting that can be. My sister was living in a small trailer out in the woods at the time, and raising a baby alone out there while her husband was gone was becoming overwhelming. The nights were long, the days were exhausting, and the loneliness was getting to her. So she decided it would be easier if she moved back into my parents' house for a while until her husband returned. That way she would have help with the baby and wouldn't have to deal with being alone all the time. At first, everything seemed normal. She set up her room again, brought the baby's things into the house, and settled into the routine of taking care of her son, with my mom helping whenever she could. For a while, nothing unusual happened. Then little things started. At first, my sister didn't even think much about them. The first strange thing she noticed was the headboard of her bed. Every now and then, usually late at night, it would suddenly slam against the wall. It wasn't a small movement either. It was loud enough to wake her up sometimes. At first, she blamed it on normal things. Maybe she had shifted in her sleep. Maybe the baby had kicked or moved. Maybe the frame of the bed was loose. When strange things happen late at night, people usually try to explain them away as something normal. But then something happened that was much harder to explain. One night she woke up suddenly, not because of noise, because it felt like someone was tickling her. At first she thought maybe it was just part of a dream. You know how sometimes your mind is still half asleep and strange sensations blend into your dreams. But the feeling was real enough that it woke her completely. When she opened her eyes, the room was empty. The baby was still sleeping. Nothing seemed out of place. She tried to ignore it and go back to sleep. For a while, she didn't tell anyone about that moment. But the strange things didn't stop. One night, things got much worse. My mom was asleep in her room when suddenly she heard screaming coming from my sister's room. Not a small scream either. A full, terrified scream. My sister was not the kind of person who scared easily. She was almost 30 years old at the time. She wasn't someone who would scream over a bad dream. So my mom jumped out of bed and rushed into her room to see what was wrong. What she saw when she walked in was something neither of them have ever forgotten. The entire bed was moving, not slightly shaking, not vibrating. The whole bed was rocking violently, up and down, side to side, back and forth. The best way my mom described it later was that it looked like a boat being thrown around in rough white water. The mattress, the frame, everything was moving hard enough that it looked completely unnatural. My sister was sitting there on the bed holding the baby, completely terrified. My mom stood there staring at it for a moment in disbelief. Then suddenly it stopped. Just like that, the room went completely still again. Now most people would probably panic at that point. But my mom and sister had been through a lot in life. They were not the kind of people who fell apart easily when strange things happened. They tried to stay calm. They checked the baby. They checked the room. Nothing else seemed wrong. Eventually they went back to sleep, though I doubt either of them slept very well that night. But the strangest moment happened later. One night my sister was sitting in bed feeding her baby. It was quiet. The baby was nursing and everything seemed peaceful. Then suddenly she felt something grab her hair. Her ponytail was pulled sharply, hard enough that it jerked her head backward. It didn't feel like her hair had caught on something. It felt like someone had grabbed it. She yelled for my mom. My mom came into the room again, and this time she did something very strange. Instead of panicking or reacting with fear, she spoke out loud. She spoke the way you would speak to a child who was misbehaving. Very firm, very serious. She looked around the room and said something along the lines of, "I understand things are different now. There's a little baby here and there hasn't been one here before. You're curious, I understand that. But you will not touch them anymore. You can stay, you can look. You were here before us. But I swear to God, you are not allowed to touch them." The way she said it was calm but commanding, like she was laying down a rule. And the strange thing is, after that moment, everything stopped. No more shaking beds, no more pulling hair, no more strange touching in the middle of the night. Nothing. Whatever had been happening in that house simply stopped completely. To this day, none of us really know what to think about it. Maybe it was something explainable that we just never figured out. Maybe it was something stranger, but the timing of it still feels eerie. Because after my mom said those words, the house went completely quiet again. When I think back to the strange things that happened when we were kids, there is one story that has always stayed with me. It's the kind of memory that seemed confusing when it happened, but as the years passed and more pieces fell into place, it became harder and harder to explain in a normal way. Even now, whenever the story comes up in family conversations, everyone gets a little quiet for a moment. The whole thing started when my sister was very young, probably around 3 or 4 years old. At that age, kids have huge imaginations. They invent characters, talk to invisible friends, and create entire little worlds in their heads. So when my sister started talking about someone named E.E., nobody thought much of it. She would sit on the floor in her room and have full conversations with someone who wasn't there. Sometimes she would laugh like someone had just told her a joke. Other times, she would whisper and nod her head like she was listening to someone explain something. When we asked who she was talking to, she would say, very matter-of-factly, that she was talking to E.E. She always described E.E. the same way. According to my sister, E.E. was an older lady. She said E.E. was very nice and liked to sit with her while she played. Sometimes E.E. would watch her draw or play with toys. Other times they would talk together. At the time, and no one in our family thought anything strange about it. Imaginary friends are extremely common for kids that age. Our parents just assumed that E.E. was something my sister had made up. Sometimes my mom would even play along. She'd ask things like, "What does E.E. think about that?" Or, "Is E.E. having fun playing with you today?" My sister would answer seriously, like E.E. was right there listening. This went on for a while, probably close to a year. Then one day, it just stopped. My sister stopped mentioning E.E. She stopped talking to someone who wasn't there. And eventually, the whole thing faded into one of those funny little childhood memories families laugh about years later. Life moved on. A few years passed, and nothing unusual happened. My sister grew older. We both started school. EE was completely forgotten. Then something happened when my sister was about 10 years old. That was the moment the story came back. At the time, my sister and I shared a bedroom. It was a normal kid's room with 2 beds, toys everywhere, and a small radio we kept on a table near the wall. The radio was pretty old, nothing fancy, just one of those simple ones with a dial and a volume knob. One evening, something unusual happened in our house. My mom suddenly got a phone call. It was from the nursing home where my grandfather was staying. My mom's father had been sick for a while, and the call clearly upset her. I remember the sudden rush of movement in the house. She grabbed her coat quickly and told my dad they needed to go right away. Within minutes, they were both out the door. That left just my sister and me at home. I was somewhere on the other side of the house at the time, probably watching TV or messing around with something. My sister was in our room doing whatever 10-year-old kids do when they're alone. The house was quiet. Then suddenly I heard something from our room. At first it was just a click, then the radio turned on, not quietly either. The volume shot up to full blast instantly. The sound of music exploded through the room, loud enough that I could hear it from across the house. Before I could even react, the volume dropped all the way down. Then the radio shut off. For a moment, everything was silent again. Then it happened again. Click. The radio turned on full volume. Then the volume knob seemed to move by itself, lowering the sound slowly until it was almost silent. Then it clicked off again. This happened 3 times in a row. At first, I assumed my sister was messing with it. Kids do weird things when they're bored, and I figured she was just playing with the radio. So I got up and walked toward our room. As I approached the doorway, I was already preparing to yell at her to knock it off. But when I stepped inside the room, I immediately stopped. My sister was sitting on her bed. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't touching the radio. She wasn't moving at all. She was sitting perfectly still, staring toward the corner of the room. Her face was completely pale. I had never seen her look that scared before. I asked her what she was doing and why she kept turning the radio on and off. She didn't answer right away. She just kept staring. Then she slowly looked at me and said something that made the hair on my arms stand up. She said, "It wasn't me." I walked over to the radio, still convinced there had to be some simple explanation. Maybe the wiring was loose. Maybe something inside it was broken. My plan was to unplug it, but when I reached behind the radio, I froze. There was no plug. The radio wasn't connected to the wall. At first, I thought maybe the cord had fallen behind something, but there was nothing there. Then I picked up the radio and checked the back. There were no batteries either. The thing had no power source at all. Yet we had both just watched it turn on and off multiple times. I slowly turned around and looked at my sister. She was still sitting on the bed, shaking slightly. Then she said something that made my stomach twist. She whispered, "It was EE." She said she saw her. She said EE was standing there near the radio. At that moment, I didn't know what to think. My brain was trying to find a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. I grabbed the phone and called my mom immediately. I was panicking a little, trying to explain what had just happened. But my mom sounded strange on the phone, upset, distracted. Then she told me something. While we were talking, she said that my grandfather had just passed away. He had died only minutes earlier. That was the reason they had been called to the nursing home. When she told me that, the entire situation suddenly felt even stranger. At the time, I didn't know what to do with that information. I just told my sister to calm down and tried to forget about the whole thing. Kids are good at pushing strange events out of their minds. So after a while, we stopped talking about it. But the story wasn't over yet. A few days later, our family gathered for my grandfather's funeral. Relatives came from different places, people we hadn't seen in years. Everyone was sharing old stories and memories. During the gathering, one of our relatives approached us with something in her hand. She said she had been going through some old boxes and found a photograph she thought our family might want. It was an old wedding picture. The photo showed my grandparents on the day they got married many years ago. My sister looked at the picture for only a second before reacting. She pointed at the woman in the photograph and said something that made everyone in the room go quiet. She said, "Hey, that's E.E." The room suddenly felt very still. The woman in the photograph was my grandmother, my mom's mother. She had died long before my sister and I were ever born. In fact, she died when my mom was only 11 years old. We had never seen pictures of her before. There weren't any in the house. When my grandfather remarried years later, my step-grandmother removed all of the old photographs of my mom's mother. By the time we were born, there were none left. We had grown up in the same house my mom had lived in as a child, but we had never seen my grandmother's face. Yet my sister recognized her instantly. She recognized her as E.E., the imaginary friend she used to talk to when she was 3 years old. The older lady, she said, used to play with her, and the same figure she claimed she saw standing in our room the night the radio turned on by itself. Even now, years later, no one in our family has ever come up with a normal explanation for that. Maybe kids pick up on things adults don't notice. Maybe memories and imagination mix together in strange ways. Or maybe, just maybe, my sister wasn't imagining E.E. at all. Maybe she had been seeing someone who had been there all along. If these stories feel familiar, there's a reason. Most people have experienced something they don't talk about. If you're still listening, leave a like and subscribe. It helps keep stories like these alive. And if something has ever followed you home, send it in. Let's continue. When I was 13 years old, my family went through one of the hardest times I had experienced up to that point in my life. My grandmother was dying from cancer. By the time this story happened, everyone in the family already understood that she did not have much time left. The doctors had told us clearly that the illness had progressed too far, and there was nothing more they could really do except try to keep her comfortable during her final weeks. My grandmother was still living in her own house during this time. It was the house she had lived in for many years, the place where so many family memories existed. Because of her condition, she could no longer take care of herself. My mother decided that the best thing to do was for us to stay there with her and help during those last weeks. So my mom and I moved into her house temporarily. My mother spent most of her time caring for her, helping her with medication, food, and making sure she was comfortable. I was 13, so there was only so much I could do, but I tried to help in small ways whenever I could. The house itself felt very quiet during those weeks. It was an older house with long hallways and wooden floors that creaked sometimes when you walked across them. At night especially, the place had a kind of stillness that felt heavier than normal. Every little sound seemed louder. The ticking of clocks, the wind outside, the faint hum of appliances. When someone is very sick in a house, the entire place seems to take on a different mood. My grandmother had reached a point where she could not move around anymore. She was completely bedridden. Even sitting up in bed required help from my mother. Walking across a room would have been completely impossible for her. The illness had taken away nearly all of her strength. Because of this, my mom stayed very alert at night. She would often wake up several times just to check on her. They make sure she was still comfortable and make sure she wasn't in pain. Those weeks were exhausting for her, but she never complained. She just wanted to make sure my grandmother was not alone during that time. One particular night stands out very clearly in my memory, even though many years have passed since then. It was late, probably around 3 in the morning. I was asleep in one of the bedrooms when suddenly my door opened quickly. My mother rushed into my room. Her voice woke me up immediately. There was something unusual in her tone. She didn't sound terrified, but she sounded confused and concerned at the same time. The way she spoke made it clear that something strange had just happened. She told me something that, even at that moment, didn't make any sense. She said that my grandmother had just walked into her room. According to my mom, she had been asleep when my grandmother entered the room, woke her up, and then walked back out again. The way my mother described it, it sounded like she had physically seen her standing there. At the time, the thought that came to both of our minds wasn't fear or anything supernatural. It was worry, because my grandmother was not capable of walking. She hadn't been able to get out of bed on her own for days. Even standing was impossible for her. The idea that she could have walked down the hallway and entered my mother's room made no sense. So the first thought we had was that something must be wrong. Maybe somehow she had managed to get out of bed and might fall somewhere in the house. Maybe she was confused or disoriented. Maybe she was trying to find help. My mother was genuinely worried about her safety. Without even stopping to think too much about it, we both ran out of my room and down the hallway toward my grandmother's bedroom. I remember the hallway being dim and quiet. The house felt completely still as we moved quickly toward her room. When we reached the doorway and looked inside, we immediately knew something was wrong. My grandmother was lying in her bed exactly where she had been before, but she wasn't moving. She wasn't breathing. She had passed away. The realization came slowly and then all at once. Even though everyone knew the illness had reached its final stage, the moment itself still felt shocking. Death always feels sudden, even when you expect it. The next hours were filled with phone calls, family members being notified, and the kind of heavy emotional silence that follows a loss like that. The entire house felt different after that moment. Because of everything happening, my mother and I never stopped to discuss what she had told me when she woke me up. The strange part about seeing my grandmother walking in the hallway simply disappeared into the background of the much bigger event that had just happened. Days passed, then weeks. Eventually, life slowly returned to normal. The funeral happened, family members visited, and gradually the intense emotions faded into memories, but the story didn't end there. Sometime later, maybe months or even years afterward, I brought up that night during a conversation with my mom. I asked her if she remembered waking me up and telling me that my grandmother had walked into her room. My mom looked confused. She told me she had absolutely no memory of that happening. At first, I thought maybe she just didn't remember the details clearly because of the emotional stress of that night. But she insisted she never said that to me. According to her memory, she had simply woken up in the middle of the night for reasons she couldn't explain. Then she checked on my grandmother and discovered that she had passed away. She didn't remember seeing her standing in the room. She didn't remember waking me up to tell me about it. She didn't even remember what exactly had caused her to wake up. Listening to her say that gave me a strange feeling, because I remember that moment clearly. I remember her entering my room. I remember her telling me that my grandmother had been walking around the house. I remember the concern in her voice when she said it. But my mother has no memory of that conversation at all. Even now, years later, when I think about that night, it gives me chills. At the time, it didn't feel creepy or supernatural. It just felt like confusion about how my grandmother could have possibly gotten out of bed. But when I look back on it now, knowing that she had passed away at that exact moment, it becomes much harder to explain. My mother still insists that she never told me that story, but I know I heard it. And every time I remember that night, it leaves me with a strange feeling that I can't fully explain. When I was younger, my uncle was always working. He was one of those people who never really had just one job. Over the years, he did all kinds of things to make money, whatever helped pay the bills. But there was one thing he always came back to, especially during the warmer months of the year. Every summer and well into late fall, he painted houses. It wasn't just some side hustle either. He ran it like a real business. He had a truck with the company name printed on the side, a phone number underneath it, and the bed of the truck was always packed with ladders, scaffolding pieces, paint buckets, rollers, tarps, and every other tool you could imagine. When people hired him, they knew he was reliable. Every now and then he would call my dad if he needed extra help. Sometimes the jobs were big, and sometimes the timing got tight. When that happened, my dad would ask me if I wanted to come along and earn a little money. I was a teenager at the time, so of course I said yes. To me, it felt like easy work. It wasn't complicated. Mostly it was just painting houses. You climb ladders, open paint cans, roll paint onto siding, and try not to spill anything. For a teenager, it paid surprisingly well. What could possibly go wrong painting houses? Most of the time, nothing. But sometimes jobs took longer than expected. Painting an entire house is a slow process. Weather plays a huge role in how quickly you can finish. If the surface is wet or the air is too damp, paint won't dry properly. One particular fall turned out to be terrible for that. It rained constantly, not just once or twice. It felt like it rained almost every single day. Days we planned to work would suddenly be canceled. Jobs that should have taken a couple days stretched into weeks. My uncle usually worked on several houses at the same time, moving between them depending on weather and drying time. But because of all that rain, everything got backed up. That meant I ended up working with him more often than usual. Honestly, I didn't mind. The job was simple and the money was good for someone my age. Then one day we got a call about a house we had been working on for a while. It belonged to a couple who lived in an old Victorian house in a quiet part of town. The wife called my uncle personally. She explained that her husband was an author and he was trying to work on his next book. Apparently the scaffolding around the house was distracting him while he tried to write. She politely asked if we could come finish the job as soon as possible. My uncle always tried to treat his customers well. The job had originally been scheduled months earlier during the summer, but because of the rain and other delays, we still hadn't finished. He didn't want to leave a bad impression, so he decided we would make their house a priority and wrap it up quickly. The remaining work should have only taken a day or two. That's how we ended up there that afternoon. I remember that day very clearly. It was late fall, and the air had that strange kind of chill that seeps through your clothes. Not freezing cold, but sharp enough that you feel it in your bones. The sky was completely overcast. Everything looked gray and dull, like the color had been drained out of the world. There was also something about the quiet that felt strange. The neighborhood wasn't noisy like some places. It felt almost too calm. The kind of calm you might imagine in the setting of a mystery novel. We pulled up in my uncle's truck and parked near the curb. The front of the house had already been finished during earlier work, so we went straight to the back where the scaffolding was still set up. The house itself was huge. Tall, narrow windows, decorative trim, steep roofing, and an attic level that sat high above the backyard. My uncle started organizing supplies while I grabbed brushes and paint cans. Like usual, he handled the detailed work. He had years of experience and was very particular about the final touches. My job was easier. I applied the first coats of paint over the larger areas of siding. After a few minutes, he looked up at the scaffolding and then back at me. Then he asked something that made my stomach tighten a little. "Are you afraid of heights?" I was 17, and even though heights did make me a little uncomfortable, there was no way I was going to admit that. So I told him I wasn't. He smiled, clearly happy with that answer. "Good," he said. Then he pointed toward the upper level of the scaffolding. "There's a section up on the third floor that still needs a coat." That's when I noticed the window. Near the top of the house was a small oval-shaped window that looked into the attic. According to the wife, the husband used the attic as his study. That's where he wrote most of his books. I grabbed the supplies my uncle handed me and started climbing the scaffolding. The metal bars rattled slightly under my weight as I climbed higher and higher. Paint cans hung from the hook on my belt, clinking softly against the metal. When I finally reached the top level, I stepped onto the platform and carefully set my tools down. From up there, the backyard looked much smaller. I took a deep breath, opened one of the paint cans, dipped my brush in, and started working. At first, it felt like any other job. Brush, dip, stroke, brush, dip, stroke. The air was quiet, except for the occasional sound of wind brushing through the trees. Then I moved closer to the attic window. The oval glass sat right in front of me as I painted the section above it. As I bent down to dip my brush again, I casually glanced through the glass. That's when I saw him. The husband. He was standing inside the attic study, and he was staring directly at me. At first, the sudden eye contact startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone to be that close to the window. I stepped back slightly and laughed awkwardly. Then I gave him a friendly smile. But he didn't smile back. He didn't react at all. His face was completely blank. I had never seen an expression like that before. No anger, no sadness, no curiosity, nothing. Just a completely empty expression. For a moment I thought maybe he was annoyed that I was outside his window while he was trying to write. But then something happened that froze me in place. Without looking away from me, he slowly raised his hand. And in that hand was a pistol. He lifted the gun to his head. The entire time, he never broke eye contact with me. For a split second, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Then he pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening. The glass window shook slightly from the force of the gunshot. I gasped and screamed, stepping backward in shock. But in that moment, I forgot something very important. I was standing on the edge of a third-story scaffold. When I stepped back, there was nothing behind me. My foot slipped off the platform, and suddenly, I was falling. The world spun around me in a blur of gray sky and wooden siding. I remember hearing my uncle shout from below. Then everything rushed past me. I crashed into a large bush in the backyard. Branches snapped and leaves exploded around me as I hit the ground. Pain shot through my leg immediately. My ankle had broken when I landed, but somehow the bush had broken my fall enough that the rest of my body avoided serious damage. I lay there for a moment, dazed, staring up at the gray sky. My uncle ran over to me, shouting my name. But the physical injuries weren't the worst part. The worst part was the image burned into my mind. That man's face, that empty expression, that cold, emotionless stare as he looked straight at me while ending his life. I had to go to counseling after that. The doctors said witnessing something like that could leave lasting trauma. They were right. Even years later, I still remember that moment perfectly. The silence, the gray sky, and the look on his face. Later, we learned more about what had been happening in that house. The man had been struggling with severe depression. He had been drinking heavily, trying to deal with writer's block and serious problems in his marriage. Apparently, everything had been building up for a long time. That day, something finally broke. His wife moved out shortly afterward. We never went back to finish the job. To this day, that house still stands empty, and I avoid driving down that street whenever I can, because sometimes I imagine that if I look up toward the backyard window, I'll see him standing there again, watching me, with that same cold, emotionless stare. I'm 23 now, but the thing I'm about to describe happened about 10 years ago. I was around 13 or 14 at the time, still in that age where your world mostly revolves around school, friends, and whatever you're obsessed with that year. For me, that obsession was skateboarding. If I wasn't in school or sleeping, I was usually on my board. My two closest friends back then were Tim and Brandon. We spent almost every afternoon together, skating around town. Our town wasn't very big, the kind of place where everyone sort of knows everyone. And there aren't many places for teenagers to hang out except parking lots, sidewalks, and random empty spots where no one yells at you for skating. That day had started like dozens of other days before it. The weather was warm, the sky was clear, and we had been skating for hours. By the time the sun started lowering, we were all tired and hungry. At least someone suggested we go to the 7-Eleven nearby to grab drinks and snacks before heading home. Since we were only 13 or 14, none of us could drive. So like always, we got there on our skateboards. The 7-Eleven was maybe 15 minutes away from the area where we usually skated, and we had made that trip plenty of times before. Nothing about that day felt unusual at first. We pushed open the door to the store and were hit with the blast of cold air from the AC. The place smelled like coffee, cheap hot dogs, and those spinning roller grills they always have near the counter. There were a few adults inside grabbing things quickly before heading home from work. We wandered the aisles for a few minutes like teenagers always do, arguing about what drinks to get and joking around. Eventually, we grabbed some sodas and snacks, paid at the counter, and headed back outside. It was early evening at that point. The sky was turning that soft orange color just before sunset. The parking lot lights hadn't come on yet, but everything was bright enough to see clearly. We walked toward the edge of the parking lot where the exit met the road. In front of the store was a highway. It wasn't a huge one like in a big city, but it was still busy enough that you couldn't just run across without waiting for a light. Since it was a small town, though, the traffic usually slowed down pretty quickly once the light turned red. So the three of us stood near the curb waiting for the light to change. I remember holding my skateboard in one hand and my drink in the other. Brandon was messing with the straw in his cup, and Tim was talking about some trick he had almost landed earlier that day. It felt completely normal. While we were standing there, I casually glanced back toward the gas pumps near the front of the store. That's when I noticed him. There was a man standing beside a white pickup truck at one of the pumps. He looked like he was probably in his 40s or maybe early 50s. He had the gas nozzle in the truck and seemed to be filling up. But he wasn't looking at the pump. He was looking straight at me. At first, I didn't think much of it. Sometimes adults look at kids skateboarding like we're annoying or something. Maybe he was just watching us. But then I realized something about the way he was staring. It wasn't casual. It wasn't curious. It was intense. His eyes were locked on me in a way that made my stomach tighten a little. I remember thinking it felt strange, like he wasn't just noticing us. He was studying us. Before I could even say anything to my friends, something happened that I still replay in my head sometimes. The man suddenly dropped the gas pump. He didn't carefully put it back. He just let it fall against the side of the truck. Then he jumped into the driver's seat. At that moment, my brain still hadn't caught up to what was happening, but then the engine roared. The truck jerked forward, and suddenly it was speeding straight toward us. Everything after that happened incredibly fast. The three of us barely had time to react. The truck shot across the parking lot directly in our direction. The sound of the engine got louder and louder in just a second or two. Someone yelled. I don't even remember who. The truck swerved slightly but kept coming. At the last second, we jumped backward and sideways out of the way. The truck missed us by inches. I felt something slam against my arm and my skateboard flew out of my hand, clattering across the pavement. The truck blasted past us and shot out toward the street. Brandon screamed something like, "What the hell, you freaking idiot!" But the truck didn't just keep going. Instead, it sped into the parking lot next to the 7-Eleven. There was a small ditch between the two parking lots, made like a shallow drop that separated them. Normally, you'd have to drive around it to get from one to the other, but this guy didn't slow down. He drove straight through it. The truck bounced violently as it crossed the ditch and came charging back toward us again. That was the moment everything shifted from confusion to pure fear. This wasn't some accident. He was trying to hit us. All three of us took off running. We sprinted across the highway as fast as we could, barely looking for cars. I remember hearing horns honking somewhere behind us as we ran. On the other side of the road was the local library. It was only about 2 or 3 blocks away, but when you're running in pure panic, it feels much farther. We ran as hard as we could toward it. My heart was pounding so loudly that it almost drowned out the sound of everything else. When we were about halfway down the block, I made the mistake of looking back. The truck was coming down the road behind us. Fast. Really fast. The man was chasing us. Tim and Brandon kept running straight toward the library entrance. I knew the library was closed because it was Sunday, but I guess in the panic we all just ran toward the nearest building. But I knew something else. Behind the library there was a small wooded area with a narrow trail running through it. That trail led almost directly to my backyard. So while Tim and Brandon ran toward the library doors, I veered off toward the woods. As I reached the edge of the trees, I looked back one more time. The truck had pulled into the library parking lot. The man jumped out. Even from the distance, I could see the anger in his movements. Everything he did was fast and aggressive. He ran to the back of his truck, then he grabbed something from the bed. To this day, I still don't know exactly what it was. In the chaos and distance, it looked like either a shotgun or a crowbar. I couldn't tell. But seeing him grab something like that sent pure adrenaline through my body. I turned and ran into the woods. Branches slapped against my arms and legs as I pushed through the trail. My lungs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't slow down. I didn't know if he was behind me. I didn't know if he was chasing me. All I knew was that I had to get home. Eventually, I burst out of the woods near my neighborhood and sprinted down the street toward my house. As I reached my street, something unexpected happened. My neighbor, who was Tim's dad, pulled up beside me in his car. He rolled down the window and shouted for me to get in. Apparently, Tim and Brandon had run to the video store where Tim's mom worked after realizing the library was closed. They had told everyone what happened. But when they described the situation, they said they didn't know where I went. They thought I might have been taken. When I got to the video store, there were 3 police officers there, and my mom. She was crying harder than I had ever seen before. Now, Tim and Brandon had told her they saw the man running toward the woods after me. They thought the guy had caught me. They thought I might have been dead. When Tim saw me walk into the store, he just stared at me for a second, like he was seeing a ghost. Then he said something that sent chills down my spine. He said he watched the man run into the woods after me. The terrifying part is that the entire time I thought the guy was chasing them, but apparently he had been chasing me. The police searched the area, but they never found him. He was never caught. And for years after that, every time I saw a white pickup truck, my heart would jump. Because for a few terrifying minutes when I was 13 years old, some random man decided to try to run us over, and no one ever figured out why. I was in high school at the time, probably somewhere in the middle of the school year. It was one of those quiet nights where nothing unusual was supposed to happen. I remember sitting at the dining room table doing homework, something I had done hundreds of times before. Our dining room was close to the front of the house, and the table sat in a spot where you could clearly see the front door if you looked up from your books. That door is something I remember very clearly even now. It had a tall glass panel in the center, maybe 2 feet wide and about 5 feet tall. The glass was covered on the inside by a lace curtain. The curtain was thin enough to let light pass through it, but thick enough that you couldn't see much detail from the outside. During the day, it made the entryway bright and soft, but at night it created strange shadows and shapes. Outside that door, there was a small porch and a screen door. The screen door opened outward and usually made a light squeaking sound when someone used it. Normally, if you let go of it, the spring would pull it closed fairly quickly. That night, it was probably around 9 in the evening. I remember because I had been watching the clock earlier, trying to finish my homework before it got too late. The house was quiet. My parents were somewhere in the back of the house doing their own things, and the television wasn't on. The only sounds in the dining room were the soft scratch of my pencil on paper and the occasional flipping of notebook pages. Outside, it was very dark. The porch light wasn't on, so the area outside the door was almost completely black. The only light reaching the porch was the faint glow from inside the house. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then I heard a sound. It was subtle, but it caught my attention immediately. It sounded like movement outside on the porch. Not loud. Not like someone knocking or dropping something. More like the small noise you might hear if someone stepped onto the wooden boards or brushed against the screen door. I paused my homework and lifted my head. For a moment, I just listened. The house was silent. No voices, no footsteps from my parents. Just that heavy quiet that makes every little sound stand out. Then I looked toward the front door. Through the lace curtain, I could see the shape of the screen door. And then something happened that made my entire body go still. The screen door started opening. I could see the outline of it clearly through the curtain as it slowly moved outward. At first, my brain tried to process it in a normal way. Maybe one of my parents had stepped outside. Maybe someone had come home. Maybe it was just the wind. But the movement didn't look like wind. The door opened steadily, like someone was holding the handle and pulling it open. It kept opening wider and wider, until it was completely open, and yet I couldn't see anyone standing there. The porch was dark, but if someone had been standing right in front of the door, I should have seen some kind of shadow or shape. Instead, there was nothing, just the open screen door and the darkness beyond it. I remember feeling a strange sensation move through my chest. Not quite panic, but something close to it. The kind of feeling where your body realizes something is wrong before your mind fully understands why. I stopped breathing for a moment. I just stared at the door, waiting, trying to figure out what I was looking at. Maybe someone was standing just out of sight, pressed against the side of the wall. Maybe they were hidden in the darkness, or maybe I just couldn't see them because of the curtain and the lighting. That seemed like the most reasonable explanation. So I stayed where I was and kept watching. The door remained open. Seconds passed, then more seconds. It felt like much longer. I remember gripping my pencil tightly without realizing it. The entire house seemed to feel different in that moment, like the quiet had become heavier. I kept expecting someone to step into view, maybe a neighbor, maybe a friend of my parents, maybe someone knocking on the door. But nobody appeared. The screen door just stayed open. It stayed like that for what felt like at least a minute. Then something even stranger happened. The door began to close, but it didn't slam shut the way screen doors usually do. Normally, when someone lets go of a screen door, the spring pulls it closed quickly, and it makes a noticeable sound when it hits the frame. This door didn't do that. It started moving inward slowly, very slowly. The movement was controlled, almost careful. It looked like someone was holding the handle and gently guiding the door closed. The door moved inch by inch, quietly, deliberately. Watching that happen made the back of my neck feel cold, because that wasn't how a door moved when the wind pushed it. That was how a door moved when someone didn't want it to make noise. I sat completely still as it continued closing. The door reached the frame and settled into place without a sound. No slam, no click, just silence. The porch was dark again. Nothing moved. Nothing else happened. I realized I had been holding my breath. Slowly, I let it out. My first thought was that someone had been there and had seen me watching through the glass. Maybe they noticed the light from the dining room and realized someone was inside. Maybe they got nervous and decided to leave quietly. That explanation made sense. But even as I tried to convince myself of that, something about the situation felt wrong. If someone had opened the screen door and then changed their mind, why close it so slowly? Why not just let it swing shut and walk away? The careful movement suggested something else, something deliberate. I finally pushed my chair back and stood up. My legs felt strangely heavy as I walked toward the front door. Every step made the floor creak slightly, which suddenly seemed louder than usual. When I reached the door, I hesitated for a moment before pulling the curtain aside and looking out. The porch was empty. The yard beyond it was dark and still. I scanned the driveway. Nothing. The sidewalk. Nothing. No figures walking away, no sound of footsteps, no cars driving off. If someone had been there, they had disappeared into the darkness very quickly. I stood there for a while, listening, trying to hear anything that might explain what I had just seen. But the night outside was completely quiet. Eventually, I let the curtain fall back into place and returned to the dining room table. But I couldn't concentrate on my homework anymore. My mind kept replaying what I had seen. The door opening, the empty porch, the slow, careful closing. Even now, years later, I still think about that moment sometimes. Maybe someone really was there. Maybe they noticed me watching and decided it was better to leave quietly. That would make sense. But the way that door moved still bothers me, because whoever closed it didn't want to make a sound. If tonight's story stayed with you, leave a like. Subscribe if you're drawn to the quiet kind of horror, the kind that doesn't need to shout. Some things don't chase you, they just wait. This is LURK. I'll see you next time.